Maserati on the lift, and that's because this is going to be my primary project for a little while. I'll be filming with it today, and I'll hopefully be filming with it over the next few months and get a few videos out on it. I'm hoping you guys will enjoy that. Today, I'm going to be working on the last major outstanding issue with this car, which is the rear control arm on the left-hand side. When people are looking to buy these cars, you'll often see that the clutch is a big deal, the clutch is what you got to look out for, it's expensive and so on. And honestly, it really isn't that much of a problem. The clutch itself isn't that expensive. It's quite labor intensive, so you're mostly paying for an hourly rate. If you're a DIYer, it's accessible. I have a video of it, so you can check that out. You can just see what's involved. It just takes some time. Where people really come unstuck is the rear control arms. Each rear control arm new from Maserati in Australia is about 6,500 Australian dollars. If you have all four control arms go, or rather all four corners go, that's 8 control arms. Gets pretty expensive pretty quick. Now, how do you tell if your control arms need to be done? Well, the first thing you'll probably notice is a clicking or a knocking noise in the back of the car while you're driving just normally. That could just be the ball joint moving around. Could also be other suspension components. Another thing you might notice is that when you're going through a corner and you apply throttle, the car's nose might dart around substantially. If you notice that, your control arms are shot. The ball joint's probably the point of failure, but if the ball joint's gone, the control arm's gone, we'll get to that later. And the reason that happens is it's a double wishbone rear suspension, so as the suspension travels, it goes through a lot of toe change. If the control arms are gone, you get a lot of toe change, and that's why your car will change direction. So those are the two things you'll notice while driving. So you can kind of tell that they need to be done when you're driving around. Usually it's when you're driving in anger. To be honest, if you own this car and you're not driving in anger, we're probably not going to be friends. But if you want to figure out if they need to be done properly, the way you do it is you get the wheel off the ground and you leave the wheel in the air, and you use the leverage of this wheel to move it back and forth.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
You'll be able to hear the ball joints or the bushings ticking. If it's really bad, you'll be able to see the wheel moving. And in this case, it's bad enough that I can do it just by moving the wheel. In most cases, a good mechanic should be getting under your car every service with a pry bar and just moving those ball joints to see if they're on their way out. It should really never get to a point where you can grab the wheel and move it. But the reason it happens is because these cars will get sold on as soon as someone gets told it's 6.5 grand for a control arm and you need 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them, the car will get sold on with this problem. So you now have a car that needs its control arms replaced. What do you do? Well, what I tried to do is I tried to buy the OEM control arms to replace the 4 rear ones on this car. What I didn't tell you at the intro is that the upper control arm is no longer available. So even if you do want to spend $6,500 an arm, you can't. It doesn't leave you with a lot of options to get your car back on the road. So I started looking around to see if there's ways to rebuild these control arms. And you cannot replace these ball joints. Now, I'm going to do an engineering discussion later on where I go over the specifics of why these ball joints cannot be replaced. But for the moment, it's fine to just work with the fact that if this ball joint is gone, the control arm's dead. So in Australia, you can legally convert a non-serviceable ball joint into a serviceable ball joint by drilling and tapping. You can buy these kits. Allows you to inject a plastic and then grease into the ball joint to fill in the gap and increase the service life of the ball joint, and then you can repeat that as needed going forward. It's been done since the 80s. It's a proven way of solving problems. I was looking at doing that, but eventually I decided against it for one critical reason. These control arms are prone to failure anyway. You can clearly see the casting seam on the back of the bushings here. On this upper control arm, you'll be able to see it on the lower as well. These control arms are cast. I believe they're die cast from the materials testing that I had done. Again, that'll show up in the engineering. They have a tendency to split the control arm along here. The front control arms have a tendency to rip the ball joint clean out of the arm altogether. The manufacturers have actually revised this rear lower arm to try and prevent failures. If you have a look at the early cars, the early 4200s and 3200s, there's a lot less reinforcement around these bushings. They're thinner, slightly different angle, and they've got some weight-saving holes cut into them. The engineering that I did highlights why they needed to make these changes. These arms are incredibly prone to failure. So it didn't seem like a practical option to proceed with rebuilding a set of existing arms. I went down the route of trying to source some good used arms as well. I reached out to Arvo over at New Model Wreckers. He's the guy who actually provided these arms to me. Really nice guy. He's not sponsoring this video, but I've put his details down below. I know he's helped a few other guys on the forum, so if you are chasing parts, reach out to him. But these arms, unfortunately, they're not in much better condition than what's in the car, so I wasn't able to use them, which left me with one option, really, with the original parts no longer being available, the serviceability of the existing arms being quite risky for failure. My last option was to make something brand new. And I will go through all of the details of this arm through an engineering discussion, but there are quite a few practical differences between the OEM arms and this. I specifically designed this to be accessible to DIYers and make the lives of mechanics easier. To begin with, I will be assembling these so that I can get them in the car, and I'll be taking you through that process. Step one is to get the bushings into the control arm. These bushings are inverted compared to the OEM arm. They go in the opposite way. The reason this was done is that if you ever need to replace these bushings, you can just put the arm in a press and press the bushings out. On the OEM arm, you need special tools to be able to get those old bushings out. Not that you'd want to anyway, because there's a fairly good chance that you'll crack your arm in the process. This one, however, has no casting seam. It's made from billet, and these bushings will be easy to push out even as they corrode and get old and have their problems. You'll just be able to push them out from each side. Then when you're putting fresh ones in that don't have those issues, it's easy to do. So I'll show you how you do it. Just start with a little bit of oil on your bushing and on the surface that you're going to insert the bushing. Place your bushing in place as best you can with just finger strength. You'll be able to get a set of press tools easily, or you can get these from me. These ones I specifically made to cover the bushings. You need yourself a nice big M14 bolt. And for this one, I will just use a couple of washers on one side to protect the bushing. Then I use the cup on the other side, and again, just a washer to protect the cup. Then an M14 nut. Thank goodness for fast forward. So as you can see, getting that bushing in is incredibly accessible even at a DIY level. You could do it with hand tools like I was starting, or you could do it with a rattle gun. I generally don't recommend doing it with a rattle gun. You've got to watch it, because sometimes as the bushing goes in, it can get a bit tight, and then all that happens is the rattle gun ends up stripping the threads on your bolt. But if you do it with hand tools, you'll be able to pull that through with no problem. So obviously it's a lot easier to do this if you've got access to a press, but I really did design these with it being possible to assemble it with spanner, ratchet, and off you go. You don't need breaker bars and things like that. Obviously, it's just a lot easier because there's a fair bit of torque in getting press fit bushings into a press fit location. Hey, pineapple. Meow. Meow. So if you have access to a press, super easy. Be done 5 minutes for, a full set of 4 arms. But as you can see, if you're a DIYer, it's very accessible. So that getting those in is easy, and then getting the old ones out is also easy. And if something goes wrong and you need to get your bushing out, it's as easy as going to a press and just getting it pressed out. There's no silliness with special tooling or trying to hold it up in crazy directions. These are designed for your mechanic to like you, which means your hourly rate will be lower if you're not doing it yourself. And if you're doing it yourself, these are designed so that you don't hate yourself while you're trying to work on them. Now I'm about to do part of the assembly that you don't need to do. If you get a set of these control arms from me, this is how they all arrive. I'm just showing you so that you understand the process. One of the issues with using aluminium parts is that you can't thread into aluminium multiple times. It will actually strip out. The ball joints are threaded bodies. This was done specifically to make sure that they're user serviceable, don't need any special tools to do it. So if these were threading in and out of the aluminium, it would damage the aluminium. And look, I'll go into more detail on this specific problem when I discuss the engineering behind the arms. But for now, the solution is to use a steel insert with a coarse thread on the outside, a fine thread on the inside, and then this gets threaded in here with a high strength Loctite that is only supposed to be released using heat and then tightened up to 200 Newton meters. This is not supposed to come out. This is here to protect this arm so that you can change that ball joint every 10 to 20,000 kilometers, if you're tracking it or whatnot. I'll discuss it in the engineering discussion why these ball joints fail prematurely and why that's a fairly reasonable life expectancy for them. So this little piece here is the main reason that I can use an aluminium part and keep it serviceable. I could have done press fit, but that's got a whole lot of high risks and you shouldn't really be doing that into aluminium parts anyway. So we'll discuss that later, but for the moment, I'll show you how this is put together. So this has been cleaned already. I use a liberal amount of high strength Loctite, so temperature release Loctite. If you need to get this out, it's not coming out. You'd need a new arm. So I'm using this quite liberally on both surfaces. This is here for life. So the reason that I assemble these before sending them out is this is the only specialized tool you need. It's a 56mm socket so that you can use a torque wrench to get the torque up to 200 Newton meters. And that's it. That's in for life now. So I'll witness mark this so that if it's ever moving, I know that there's a problem. So another step that you shouldn't need to do, but if you ever have to replace these ball joints, you need to know, is how to install the ball joint. Use low strength Loctite, give it a good shake, and you won't need anywhere near as much of this as you did with the high strength Loctite. A significant reason for that is that once this is installed in the car, it's actually impossible for a threaded body to back out, and I'll be able to show you that during the install. So I normally just put a little bit on the body of the ball joint and screw it in. So if you need to replace your ball joints, that's how hard it is. I then just get a medium-sized hammer and a punch. You are supposed to do this with a C-spanner. I just don't have one that's the right size. You don't need to get one. A punch and a hammer is sufficient. And you literally just tap it until a moderate force won't turn it anymore. And then the other side for good measure. Once that's snug, witness mark it. I like to witness mark it on both sides, since this arm can be used on either side of the car. And that way, when you're doing an inspection, if you witness mark both sides, you can, regardless if you put it on the left side or the right side of the car, you can quickly tell which, if it's moved or if it's loose for any reason. So with these, this is how they will arrive if you order them from me. They will be a ball joint installed with the sleeve installed, ready to go on the car. So now I'm up to the important part of the job, which is actually installing the arms. It is honestly a lot easier than you might think, especially when I warn you that you have to lower the subframe to do the job. That might set off a few alarm bells, but as you'll see, it's actually not that big a deal. I don't remember all the sizes for the bolts that are in there, so you'll have to put up with me swapping tools a little bit, but we'll get into this and it should be a good bit of fun. So I've got my lower arm ready to go, my upper arm ready to go after about 5 minutes of assembly. I've got studs, and these studs are something that I get manufactured specifically to match my ball joints for the long and the short. This is the lower and the upper arm. You'll see why I get these manufactured instead of using the OEM studs as we get to it. But to begin with, I'll be pulling off the wheel, surprise, and then I'll also be pulling off the brake caliper and rotor. You don't actually need to pull those off for the job, but I have to do extra work so that I can show you guys how to do the job. So let's get to it. Getting the caliper and rotor off isn't too difficult. There's just the 2 bolts holding the caliper on, and then there's the 2 bolts holding the rotor hub in place. These are custom designed rotors, which you can also get from me, the 2-piece rotor setup. There's another video which you can look at in the description, or it'll probably be popping up on the side somewhere, and you can go and have a look at the installation for these. I just need to get this out so that you guys can clearly see what I'm working on. So I now have everything out of the way for you. I can actually talk about what the job entails. Over on this side, this is the ABS line, and you can see the little retention clips here. I've already popped that out. You just get your fingers underneath and pull. Very easy. Coming around the control arm, we have this connection here for the lower bolt on the shock absorber. One of the ways that Maserati, or rather I should say the Fiat Group cars, because this period of Ferraris do the same thing, one of the ways that I would keep these arms aluminium and so lightweight is that the heavy lifting is done by the shock absorber directly into the hub. So if you have a look at Japanese cars from the same time, like an MX-5 for example, you will see that the shock absorber usually lands in the middle of the lower control arm, and they didn't do that here. So that was really clever, and it also means that they have a bit more control over the camber change as the car moves up its arc. This provides control to the arc in a different manner than when you run the suspension into a control arm, which is a really cool thing to know, but not really relevant to the job we're doing. So as we come around here, there's a stud that goes from this ball joint through the hub, and it's bolted on the other side of this toe adjustment rod here. As we go down the toe rod, you can see these group of bolts and locking nuts that are used to retain the toe rod in place. They can end up quite corroded and very difficult to remove. Then behind that we have the main bolt for the control arm, which is packed full of shims to make sure that the arm is centered, and further back you can adjust the camber, so you can use this to set toe as well as centering the arm. The upper arm is much the same, except it's partially occluded by the chassis, so you need to lower the control arm to be able to remove the bolts. Coming back around the front here, this stud and this tow rod can cause quite a bit of difficulty. If this is loose enough, sometimes I can get it free and remove the arm without having to remove this stud here. But usually it's easier to just double nut this stud and remove it straight from the ball joint then you've got more room to pull the arm out. So I'll see how it feels, but time to get to it. So I've gone straight for the double nut method and decided to just try and pull the stud out. It's usually easier than dealing with the tow rod. So we'll see how we go. Not free yet. Yeah. Damn. That was a bit harder than I wanted it to be, but honestly, that's about what I'd expect. They've been there for a long time, those control arms, and the real cause of the issue is that even with the tow rod adjusted to its max, it's still just too long to pull out of the control arm, and that means you can't separate it from around the hub here, so you have to separate the stud. And the only reason I was able to pull that stud out is because I destroyed it. That's one of the reasons why I've got new studs. But the new studs that I use, and I should have thought about that before I had to awkwardly climb up there. You can see they've actually got a 9mm hex on them so that you can just do them up and undo them with a socket instead of having to try and double nut it, and if a double nut fails, then destroying your stud. So these studs should be reusable for quite some time. Removing the lower control arm is now pretty straightforward. It's just these two bolts. They're 22mm on the nut side, and they should be 22 on the bolt side. They are. So you get an ugga dugger, set it to maximum, and you pull them off. You'll then need to get a pin punch to punch the bolts through and catch the stream of raining shims as they pour down upon you in good luck. And it comes raining down. So I need to get the arm ready to go in the car. I've just covered the bolt and the receptacle in anti-seize. These are a high quality stainless steel, 316, but that won't stop build up if any moisture gets in there, making it difficult to remove. So I will be nice to someone in the future, probably me, since this is my car, and I will get some anti-seize in there to make it a little bit easier to adjust. So while I'm doing that, I will talk about one interesting thing about the way that this needs to be set up for installation. The thread pitch here is a 3mm thread pitch, and on this it's a 1.5. That means that these two parts move with a 2-to-1 relationship to each other. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's because it doesn't make any sense to anyone. All it does is make it really, really difficult to predict the toe movements while you're adjusting. So you kind of just have to hope that you eyeballed it roughly in the right place when you're getting your toe in, so that you have enough adjustment for whoever's doing your alignment that they don't need to take the arm off. And other than that, it's really hard to sort of know. So what happens is, as I screw this in, I'll get this all the way down like so. As this one goes in, it's moving twice as far as this end is. So as that goes in that way, because of the difference in thread pitch. And I need to put that out there. So as I do that, this is actually moving further in, but it's moving further in at half the speed that this is moving further in. And that's how you adjust it. So if I set this all the way out as far as I can go in this direction, which is what I'm doing right now, that is as much toe out as this car is ever going to get. You don't really want any toe out on this vehicle unless you're a psychopath who has a death wish, because it would be incredibly twitchy, especially at high speeds. So I tend to just set it to what I hope is the maximum amount of toe out, and then let it be adjusted to be pulling for toe in. So to get this installed, get a pin punch, stick it in the ball joint and move it as much out of the way as you can. Using that bit of gap, you can then get it into the hub and use the leverage of the arm itself to bring the toe adjuster around. This is the hardest part, this bit. Once this bit's done, we're pretty much finished, because the subframe might sound like the bigger job, but it isn't, because you just put the lift under it while you undo them all. Yeah. You do one of them up like 3 turns, and then you just let it sag, and that's it. Yeah. So at this point, it might be tempting to put it back together, but don't. Just get your bolts in place. Don't even bother with the nuts at this point. Just get it assembled. And what we're going to try and do is put the wheel back on and see if we're visually around 0 toe. And then if we are, then we'll tighten everything up on the lower end. But you need to be basically with a little bit of toe in or out, depending on how you want to set up your adjustment, so that you can make life easier for whoever is doing the toe, for whoever's doing your wheel alignment. Otherwise, you're paying for their time. Okay, I've got a bit of toe in. That was a satisfying sound. So I can't align the toe in my garage. I don't have the tools for it, but I can tell that it's towed in. The way that I've set this up means that I can only adjust for more toe in. As this comes out, this goes further out and the whole assembly twists inward. What I need to do is I need to keep this in roughly the same position, but drive the adjustment bolt further out so that it can be adjusted for a little bit of toe out and a little bit of toe in. So I need to rotate these against each other. So that I have some adjustment. So now I'll have the ability, if this was pinned, this will give me a little bit more toe in by coming out. But as I go the other way, I'll be able to pull some toe in. So hopefully I can get to around 0 toe, which is where I prefer this car for its wheel alignment, for its behavior. So once you have a wheel on and you like the look of it and you think you've got enough adjustability, try and spanner it to roughly 0 toe visually. Make sure that you've got a bit of adjustment either side when it looks like it's in that position, and then we can progress to the upper control arm. Once you've finished this step, you're about 2/3 of the way through the process. I need a bit more toe in, so I need to actually make sure that it will toe in. So I'm going to adjust it to the maximum I've got with this current alignment, and hopefully when I put it back on the ground, it will look like it's heavily toed in. If that's right, then I've got it in a position where I can go from heavily toed in to heavily toed out. So when it goes to Mr. Wheel Alignment Man, they can just get the job done. So looking at this, there's clearly a lot of toe in. It's very obvious. So it's in a good position now. It means I can adjust it from being heavily toed in to heavily toed out, which should give enough range to the wheel alignment team that they'll be able to get it to a little smidge of toe in. Once you're happy with the general alignment, it's time to start tightening things up. And there is a particular order to doing this, like there is with the whole damn thing, and it can be a bit counterintuitive, so we'll just start and follow along. So we start with our stud here, and then once it's in, you'll know it's tight because it'll start spinning the ball joint. You can hold the ball joint on the other side and tighten a little bit more. I strongly recommend using a cut down spanner, not a full size spanner. These have a tendency to pop the dust boot off. Ask me how I know. I just need to get the nut back on. You should replace nylock nuts whenever they come off, because the nylon usually gets damaged. I'm cheating and using some thread locker. Next, we put our arm back in its cradle, permanently this time. And this is Pineapple, everyone. This is my cat. He'll come and help me by sitting on my lap. Sometimes he'll sit on my lap the entire time, even when I'm hammering and drilling and making loud noises. And then I can't finish the job because everyone knows it's bad luck to upset a sleeping cat. So hopefully he doesn't sit on my lap today, otherwise we won't finish the video. So the shims fill in the gaps. You should be able to see it with the pry bar moving around in there. And there'll be a gap on either side which you can use to lever the arm to sort of center it. I try to center the arm so that there's a bit of a gap on both sides of the bolt for both sides of the arm, and use a shim in any side. So at the moment I'm just moving it to get an idea of where to center it around. So I'm going to put a small shim here and then lever it across and try and fill it that way. It can help to have some small tools to help you tap and move shims into place. So this will just take a little bit of screwing around. I got these shims from New Model Wreckers. in case anyone needs a bucket of shims so that they can do this. You can either buy them new or you can try and hit up some wreckers like Arvo over at New Model Wreckers. Once you're happy that the arm is as reasonably well centered as it's going to be and that the shims aren't just loosely falling out, you can do up your 2 nuts for the main bolts. And then if you're doing it on a car like mine where it has xenon headlamps, you can tighten this up as well. You will need to tighten up these retaining bolts, but I wouldn't stress too much about those because these will need to be adjusted at your wheel alignment. Because the entire assembly is floating in multiple axes, it's floating for camber, toe, and centering, this will all be getting undone again anyway. You really just need it to be tight enough to drive wherever it needs to go for a wheel alignment. Once this is on, we move on to the upper control arm, and through the magic of editing, we're working on that now. Now the upper boy is really easy. You don't have to screw around using it to adjust the toe. You can literally just pop that out, and then once you free it from these upper bolts, you can just take it out and put a new one in. The problem is that these bolts will clash with the chassis where my finger is here, and I believe they clash on the other side as well, but they definitely clash here. The only way around this is to lower the subframe. So there's a subframe bolt in here where my finger is. There is another one way up in here. And the last one is buried way over here. In order to lower this without having to disconnect everything, I'm using my hydraulic table and I have some rubber supports up on the subframe. What I'll be doing is I'll be undoing the bolts fully and then putting them in 3 turns on both sides. I will then lower the hydraulic table to take the weight, to release the weight onto the hanging bolts, and that droop will be enough to release this bolt out. And then I push it back up and tighten everything. All right, as I went through and undid all those bolts, you would see in the video that I actually spun them back in a little, and that's so that they have a few threads to be able to support the subframe. I'm now going to lower the subframe. The suspension can stay where it is, and you'll see the whole thing lower, and it should be just enough to remove that bolt there. Do it very gently and quietly so you can hear if anything is catching. So if you come and have a look, you can see the subframe is now suspended about 10 millimeters lower, hanging off the bolts. Hopefully that's enough, otherwise I'll just need to back it off a little bit to lower it, but we'll find out now. That's a good start. Go. Out it comes. Easy. Now, shims will rain down. Now, shims will rain down spectacularly as I tap this down. There they go. With that out of the way, I can tap the ball joint out. Geez, this one's stuck in there. So you should be able to see why it's important to get the lower arm on before you try and do the top arm, because if this thing's flopping around, you've got no chance. All right. Gotta pull this guy out somehow. There we go. You can see how bad this one is with all the corrosion around the flan blocks. But the ball joint on this one is the real issue. This is the one that was causing all the knocking. With the upper, because it's so much easier, I like to put the stud in first and actually tighten it in and then assemble it from there. Cool. And that's most of the installation done. As before, you need to get the bolts in place and then press the shims in from that point, trying to center the arm as best you can. I have to fight the suspension travel. How am I going to do that? You will need to fight the suspension travel somehow. So either take the suspension off if you're planning on doing it that way, or have something that can compress the suspension to an extent. All right, so once you get your shims in place, time to get your nuts back on and start tightening things up again. I'm not actually loading the suspension up as I tighten everything, which is what you're supposed to do with bushings. The reason I'm not doing that is because these aren't bushings. These are flan blocks. So later on, when I go over the engineering of everything, I will show you what a flan block is, but it's better off thinking that this is a ball bearing than a bushing. It has more in common with a bearing. And for that reason, they can be tightened in any position and they'll be able to move. So the reason I'm not using the rattle gun is I don't want to shake out all the shims and have to start this process again. That's a bit better. So before you start putting everything together, make sure you try and move around as much as you can with a couple of pry bars. Make sure that all the slack has been taken up with the shims, otherwise you're going to have to redo the whole job. You don't want to be driving around after doing all this, hearing clicks and bangs as the suspension's moving around. The other really important thing, when you go to tighten up your subframe, like I'm about to, make sure it is fully supported by whatever you use to lift it, so that you can tighten those bolts rather than lift the subframe with the bolts. Well, that's the job, and those are the control arms. So that's how you install the control arms. This obviously is the same process pretty much for the OEM control arms and this. I'll go over all the details of engineering a bit later on, either in this video or another video. That's for future me to decide. Alright guys, everything's now back together, so let's find out if I did the job properly.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
No movement at all. Nice new ball joints.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.
No play in the shims. No play in the tow rod. You can actually get your hand on those items if you want to really check, but that's done. That's as it should be. No movement. And most importantly, replaceable ball joints. Because as you'll see in the engineering discussion, these ball joints will always fail prematurely compared to ball joints in other designs because of the way it was implemented. So if you want to drive your car at all, I highly, highly recommend getting them done in a way that you can replace the ball joint.